In this video, I'm going to show you exactly how I made this restoration hardware inspired console table. I recovered the beam from this old locomotive factory that's now being turned into a residential building. It was built in the late 1800s, and this was the machine shop of the Rogers Locomotive Works. And this is exactly what it used to look like in its heyday. So here's just an example of the types of locomotives they would build in this machine shop. These are old relics of the past that are pretty cool, in my opinion. So this is a piece of eastern white pine. I believe it's about 7.5 by 11. And they were just about to throw it out because they had to pour some floors and they couldn't keep this thing around. So I recovered it right before they were about to throw it in the dumpster. But this thing is gorgeous and it's just got a lot of character to it. And I thought it would make a really cool table. So the first thing I did was to try to get all the nails out of it that were going to cause me an issue when I had to make the table. And then I went right into just trying to square off the edges. The table measures approximately 82 long by about 32 high. But the challenge was to try to cut these with the saw that I had would only go about halfway through the beam. So I had to try to cut it as square and as flat as possible. The best method I found was to draw a line all the way around it with a square and try to attempt to do this in just 2 cuts. I cut it through, flipped it, and then took the saw kerf mark and tried to draw the line completely around to the other side and cut that side. And it worked out pretty well, but it took me a couple of attempts to get it good enough that I could have this thing lay flat on the floor. And as you can see, I'm wrestling this thing around because it's really heavy. This is very heavy eastern white pine. So as I was reading up on eastern white pine, I found that apparently it takes decades to get this dark brown sort of color to it. And you'll see later on as I clean it up a little bit, it has a beautiful amber to brown hue to it, which is really hard to recreate. So the challenge of building this table was to try to leave as much of the character as I could. The method I used was to take a wire brush on a drill and start cleaning it up as much as I could. And I also used a hand wire brush that helped me keep the character of it and not take out too much of the color. This was definitely the most labor-intense part of the project. It took me hours to just wire brush this thing, vacuum it up, and then later on you'll see I did sand it with 80 grit and then 120 grit just so I can rub my hand along this thing and not get splinters. A lot of times when you're doing a project with some reclaimed material, you know it was reclaimed, but you really don't know that much about where it came from. And I think that makes this all the more interesting that this came from the machine shop and was a major support holding up the building. And you can see there's a couple holes that the machinery was probably tied into at some point. Now, as mentioned earlier, this is restoration hardware inspired, but I wanted to give it my own unique flair and make it a little bit different, not exactly copying it. So I wanted these end grains exposed, but one of the problems was when you cut an aged piece of wood like this, it exposes all the wood and you can see the whiteness of the pine there. And I had to figure out a method, which we'll go over later, on how I aged it. And then when the laborers were throwing the piece out, they exposed and took out a lot of chunks of it. And here I am just kind of softening out the pieces. I didn't want to try to go overboard on it. Like I said earlier, just wanted to make it so you're not going to get major splinters and have an issue down the road with something like that. Out of all 4 sides of the beams, 2 of them were rough and 2 of them were really smooth. So on the rough sides, the sandpaper really started to get clogged up easily. So I was vacuuming as I went along, and then every now and again I would take the sanding block and vacuum off the block itself to get all the grit out of the sandpaper to help it last longer. One thing I noticed about these reclaimed beams is they're so old and dried out that they're pretty brittle, and there was a lot of chunks that came off. And what I did was save the chunks, as many of them as I could, and tried to glue them back in. And I used just this standard wood glue, clamped it on, waited for it to dry, and then just sanded it down the best I could. And those other chunks that you see right by my hand there that are missing, and you see the exposed inner part of the pine, I ended up using a grinder, and I kind of burnished them and smoothed them out to blend them in. And the grinder runs at such a high RPM, it essentially just burns the wood while also smoothing it. And I think it turned out pretty well after I sat there for a little bit and just kept on grinding away at a high RPMs. The other method I used was using a propane torch after I used the grinder, and I slightly would just sit there and burn it and then sand it and then burn it again until it blended in. Now, you didn't get a perfect match, but it was really good and almost hard to tell afterwards. But just passing that along, that method works great. I also use the same method on the end grains, and you'll see that later on, burning it, sanding it, burning it, sanding it, until the whiteness of the pine started to look more like the rest of the beam and a little more well-aged. One thing that sets this table apart from other reclaimed console tables I've seen is the joinery method I used. Many other ones will use a dovetail, which look absolutely beautiful, but I wanted to do something completely different. So right there I was drawing a line to attach these things, and these are 1-inch brass dowels. And on one end, I'm going to epoxy them in, and then on the underside of the table, I will drill through the bottom of the table, through the brass dowels, and I will tap them and put bolts to attach, while simultaneously leaving a gap, and it really gives it this interesting, unique look. Used a portable drill press in order to drill out the 1-inch holes. They're about 2.5 inches from the edge. And as you can see, I used 2 pieces of flat stock to go across the beams before I drilled them. And the reason I did that is because the beams were slightly concave, probably because of aging and drying out over the years. So this really helped me to get a nice plumb or straight hole. To prep the dowels, I tapered the end of them on the bench grinder, just giving it a slight taper so that when I assembled this, they fit into the hole nicely and didn't knock out a chunk of the hole. And then took a cutting disc on the grinder and then put a couple of slots in it. As you'll see, I'll show you a close-up here, and that is to hold the epoxy to give it to somewhere to go, so it gives it a nice strong hold once I glue those in. I laid everything down on the MDF board, and I'm using a 6-foot level here to just make sure everything is in line, and nothing is glued up yet, and I'm just getting ready to drill the holes into the top piece. And right here I'm just taking a small little pencil and I'm tracing around where the dowels are going to go into the top, and then I'll take a portable drill press and drill into the top, into the edges. And this was a little tough actually, because this white pine is very soft, but it can be brittle, and it kind of wanted to throw around the drill press, but it did end up working out. And I drilled them to about, I'd say, 2.5 inches deep. And then you'll see later on I will drill down into the dowels to complete the assembly. So here I'm just taking a square and I'm finding the center of the hole that I just drilled into the top piece into the edge, and I'm transferring them up and around to this is actually the underside of the table that I'm kneeling on right now. And then I'll drill down into the dowels. And then I just used the JB Weld epoxy. And I've used this on so many projects, and people sometimes have a tendency to think that epoxy is not going to hold. And I've just used this enough over the years to know that this stuff just holds absolutely rock solid. And I actually put a test on this at the end, and I stood on top of the table and was moving all around, and this just is not going anywhere. And after I glued it up and masked off the holes, I assembled it, just a nice dry fit on the other end, and then I had to use a sledgehammer with a little piece of MDF there to bang it in, because I wanted it to dry in the exact same position, so this way I can be absolutely sure that it's going to be able to be assembled and unassembled. And then here I am just making sure that everything is perfectly square. After the epoxy dried, I was ready to drill down into the dowel rods. And then I took a 1-inch auger bit, drilled in about 3/4 of an inch, and that's for the bolts to recess inside so you won't be able to see them after the fact. And then I took a 5/16 inch bit and drilled directly down into the brass rods. And then I took a piece of tape there just so I know how deep I needed to go and didn't want to overshoot. I took it apart and then just tapped with a 3/8 tap. And obviously you can see where the bolts are going to go into. And it just made sure the bolts went in and out nicely, and that it wasn't going to be a problem to assemble and unassemble that. And the reason I did all of this is because this table is so heavy that you need to be able to break this thing down into parts. And then right here, I'm just sanding any of the epoxy that came out and just giving it this sort of brushed brass look. Because the way I did this was I made it so there was going to be a little bit of a reveal so you can see the brass rods on the project. Widened out the 5/16 hole to 1/2 inch so I wouldn't have any problem putting the bolts in to make it nice and easy to assemble and unassemble. And I was going to get brass bolts, and then ultimately I just went with stainless steel bolts because they weren't going to be seen anyway, and I put a 3/8 washer which fit into the 1-inch recessed hole perfectly. After I finished assembling this thing, I did another burn and another sanding on the whole thing. And the end grain, it took me about 2 to 3 tries of burning and sanding to just kind of make it match the rest of the project. But the thing to note here is just look at those growth rings, a very old growth, and this log is hundreds of years old. And right here, I'm just putting in a beeswax, but I had a major problem. I thought I messed the project up because it looked very mute, and it muted out all the character. So at the end, after this thing dried, I just sanded it, and then it started bringing out the character again, and I was really happy with the way it turned out at the end. And I got a bunch of closing shots here, maybe about a minute's worth, and that's the reveal I'm talking about. You can see the brass rods. It's about 3/4 of an inch, and it just gives it a unique sort of look. But overall, I'm really happy with the way this thing turned out. It kept all the character that I wanted it to do, and I'll just leave you to look at it, and you see all the amber colors, and the chunks kind of blended in nicely when I was done. You can see the end grain, which is what I was going for, and I'm super happy with the way it turned out. And there's some of the holes from the machining and some of a lot of original scuff marks and dents, which I think just gives it all the character in the world. Thank you very much for watching, and I will catch you in the next video.